The grand finale. It's an interesting task to write something from the perspective of already knowing the outcome. It's often done particularly in an historical context, of course, but there still allows for a lot of leeway to be told from many different sides and angles. Join us now for more Liber-Tea, where we continue on our journey through this fascinating war, although knowing the outcome, but of course exploring new aspects without ever forgetting that the grand finale was a legacy story worth telling over and over. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment all throughout our videos and invite others to join in on the conversation. We last left off in this series with the turning of the tide. World War II is starting to get a complete overhaul. Axis forces are retreating, and Allied forces are on the winning offensive. The good guys versus the bad guys, and we're starting to move from glimmers of hope to all-out ticker-tape parades of looking forward to a future filled with peace and goodwill again. In other words, spring is coming. We last left this dramatic series in the cold, harshest conditions of winter, with extreme physical conditions, not only stripping the men of their strength and energy, but emotionally and mentally sapping anything that was left. But as the seasons change, the Allied forces, infantries, knew spring was coming, and, in almost a surge following the seasons, the Allies started winning ground and territory, taking back to unify, restore, and make sovereign once again what seemed completely lost. With 1945 officially the last year of the war, the Allied forces were starting to feel as if they could do no wrong. Most maneuvers and strategies were finally working consistently in their favor. Unfortunately, as with many wars, even with this swell in success, the war would drag on for almost another 5 months, still claiming countless lives. In April, Soviet forces captured Vienna in what is often referred to as the Vienna Offensive. The battle style is often referred to urban combat, which means that fighting and tactical maneuvers must be tailored to the somewhat unusual conditions of fighting within a town, village, and/or city, with many civilians and other city-dwelling challenges. You can imagine what that must mean for the strategists on both sides, especially considering the times we live in now, 2022. But of course, we always like to land on the side of the good guys, and while the demands were quite high for the Allied forces, they would eventually triumph through several intense and heated weeks of street-to-street fighting. They would eventually capture Vienna. The fall of Berlin in 1945 was the final great offensive by the Soviets on behalf of the Allied forces. At this point, a bird's-eye view shows German forces, and more specifically Hitler, destitute, drained, and reduced to a skeleton of what he once was. In the span of about 4 years, he went from advancing, triumphant conqueror to a weakened man shaking and quivering in the dark, empty halls of his doomed, sealed fate. He was completely stripped now of all hope that he would dominate the world as he once thought. The battle for Berlin would be the final nail in his proverbial coffin. In a desperate, disgusting attempt to regain a little ground which he continually was losing, historical archives show Hitler recruiting and awarding accolades to young boys, some as young as 16 years old. Meanwhile, Nazi forces were completely out-resourced at this point, and all that the Axis forces could do was slow the pain of defeat, but certainly and thankfully not stop it. Soviet forces were relentless in attacking, both from the ground and the air, and surrounded Berlin as the last major advance. About 1.5 million Soviet soldiers accomplished this in a matter of weeks. The ever-proud Hitler refused to leave the capital and spent his last remaining days in an underground bunker for a total of around 105 days. During this time, quite a few activities took place, none of them pleasant, but I guess we're not too surprised by that. He married Eva Braun, who, against his wishes, joined him for these final days. Other top officials and their families, including a propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, and his wife Magda, with their 6 children. On April 29, 1945, Hitler wrote his last political will and testament detailing his account and wishes, although it was reported that not everything was directly from him, including edits, suggestions, and other chosen words offered up by Herr Goebbels, a man who greatly admired Hitler. Throughout the next years after the initial discovery, much of what was reviewed was thoroughly discussed, tested, and logged in as evidence to make sure these documents were authentic. A few other men were accounted for in these documents and bunker living. Although Goebbels and his wife would later commit suicide along with killing their children by cyanide, a few men did survive the bunker. Two top officials completely changed their identity. One man went back to his home in Westphalia and buried his documents in a bottle in his backyard. And on April 30th, 1945, Hitler and his new bride committed a joint suicide. After, both of their bodies were burned and set on fire. In the beginning of May 1945, Germany signs two unconditional surrenders with the commander of the Allied forces, U.S. President General Dwight D. Eisenhower in Northwest Europe. But let's not forget this was a world war, which means some of the lesser-known activities during the ending days are still taking place, which means on the Pacific front there will be one more very significant memory that is about to happen before the official ending of World War II. Allied troops conquer Okinawa at the southwest tip of Japan, and then on August 6, 1945, the U.S. drops the first of two atomic bombs on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, killing around 70,000 men, women, and children instantly, with many more thousands dying from radiation exposure. And then, on August 9th, just 3 days later, the U.S. dropped the second of the atomic bombs on the city of Nagasaki, bringing about around 40,000 casualties. A popular question to ask is, are these cities still radioactive today? The short answer is they are, although subpar levels with no effects on humans, in case anyone wanted to make a summer vacation to either of these cities. And then, on September 2nd, 1945, Japan officially surrenders to the Allied forces, officially ending World War II. Wow, that was quite a journey, don't you think? As we started in this series, we learned how important strategy plays a part in the planning, success, and failure of all parts of war. So let's spend the next few moments sharing what were important lessons we learned or can learn from world global events on such a massive scale such as this one. First, the most obvious is that from the cost of resources, lives, heartache, sorrows, wasting such potential for good and progression in this world of human lives, we should work to avoid war at all costs. Not only are real people's lives totally affected in devastation, but it is something that often wreaks havoc generations after. The second is each country home must be prepared and ready to defend against an aggressive attack, unfortunately. The third lesson is that often, not always of course, but often, the ending of such dramatic events brings about some of the country's best policies in terms of advancing legacies that promote unity and pacifism. While, of course, we realize this is not a good reason to even start such tragic storylines, in the end, as long as we can learn from these in terms of what to do and what not to do next time, then hopefully all is not lost. Some inventions we shared before are also in use even to this day. Discoveries like computers, superglue, radar, and even Tupperware were all used in the war and are still to be found in our modern-day life. Unfortunately, there are some bad consequences left over as well. Thousands of underground bombs in landmines are still being discovered to this day, and many abandoned tanks are still around too. Some of the leftovers that are still seen today include rebuilding the infrastructure and buildings, which of course can never be restored in such a way that keeps the legacy of what was supposed to be originally there. Although much of Western Europe is often discussed in these topics, Russia was also heavily affected. And of course, we should always mention from both sides the terrifying effects of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Men and women were never the same after all of this. Children, if they survived, would often experience depression, anger, outbursts, and extreme fear and worry. In all of this, we should never take the absence of war for granted. Although there are different wars for different times in varied, degreed measures of death and destruction, the tragic consequences always result in the same. When people are charged with killing other people, no matter what the reason, the shame, guilt, anxiety, fear, and anger experienced by all involved bring about the worst of results from everyone involved, carrying legacies of irreparable damages. Thank you for following along as we work to experience the war from all different sides and numerous separate angles of this fascinating, often written about historical war. Join us next time. Comment, like, and subscribe, and find out more from Liber-Tea, where we continue to bring you entertaining and informative facts and stories from all parts of life, history, and the world.